present, his lawyers, Mr. Williams here representing the people, all of our jurors and alternates are present. Thank you for being on time. We had technical difficulties. I suppose if we had not had technical difficulties, someone would have been stuck in traffic. There's always something, it seems. But we do our best, and if we all do it one of these days, we'll start exactly at 9 o'clock. That's my answer.
I don't think I can do it. So I went back and I changed, and then as I'm leaving the second time, and I'm maybe not going to make it, I'm like, oh my God, did I have this tie on last week? If I did, is the jury going to notice? They're like, oh my God, does he only
That's
have...
the technical difficulties we have.
That is not... I still made it on time. So I'm like, well, do I go change the tie? And I'm like, either way, I'm still going to be fat. It's not going to make a difference. I'm lining up here. That's what there is. So to really make a big difference. So if I am wearing the tie I wore last week, I do own more than 4 ties. And now I'm going to organize so I don't repeat. I don't know if I did, but I had a feeling I had. Anyway, appreciate all your patience. Let me get back to where we were here. So we were talking about, at the point in the opening, there had been a reinvestigation. Mr. Durst had just explained how he found out about it. Now, he says that, oh, sure. You know what? I think I have to move to the left where they can't, I can't move to the right. I have to be in this square. Come up a little. Yeah. Let me move this here. Is that better? Okay. All right. So, although Mr. Durst says he found out about the reinvestigation on October 31st, 2000, we're going to produce evidence that shows he actually found out about it earlier. On October 23rd, so this is the 11 days before Mr. Durst allegedly found out that they were reinvestigating his wife's disappearance, he wrote himself a check for $9,000. Now, this would be the first of what would prove to be a pattern of what is called structuring money that Mr. Durst would do. And you're going to hear from not only Mr. Durst in the Galveston trial. This is Mr. Durst answering. To cash a check for more than $10,000, there's a big form that gets filled in, and it takes a long time, and it goes to some agency, someplace or another. And I always paid a lot of bills with cash and stuff, restaurants and things like that. But when this first happened in November of 2000, when I first ever went bananas and came down here, I knew if I ever had to go into hiding, I would need cash. So I started withdrawing money from banks, and I sort of just kept doing it like on remote control or something like that. That's Mr. Durst's testimony from Galveston. So Mr. Durst was aware that there's a reporting issue when you take out more than $10,000 that is reported. So you're going to hear from FBI financial crimes analyst Eric Van Dorn. Now, Agent Van Dorn is going to testify that this structuring conduct started at the very latest October 23rd of 2000, and it continued through 2001. Now, in addition to the structuring, there was additional evidence that Mr. Durst was aware before October 31st, 2000 of the reinvestigation of Kathie's disappearance. So on October 30th, 2000, this is the day before he allegedly found out about the reinvestigation, Mr. Durst executed the following document. This is a durable power of attorney that gave Mr. Durst, the woman who would become his wife, they were not legally married at this time, they would get married very soon after. This gave her power of attorney, in essence, over his money. Now, who is Debbie Lee Cheriton? Debbie Cheriton is an experienced real estate professional. She and Durst were introduced by Nick Chavin in 1988 and soon after began dating. In the early 1990s, Cheriton and Durst moved in together. After a year and a half living together, they decided to move out. So they had the relationship didn't end, it continued, but they were now living in separate places. The relationship continued after Durst left New York for Trinidad in 1995. In 1998, he began spending more time with Sheridan during his periodic visits to New York. On October 30th, 2000, again, the day before he allegedly found out of the reinvestigation, he gave Sheridan power of attorney. On November 2nd, 2000, allegedly Durst told Sheridan about the reinvestigation. On November 3rd, Durst asked Sheridan to marry him. This information regarding what's up here right now, the November 2nd and November 3rd items, those are coming from Mr. Durst himself, and I'll get to the document that establishes that. So that is what he is saying happened. On November 5th, 2000, Susan Berman authored a letter to Bob Durst that outlined her financial difficulties. Although there is no direct evidence that Durst ever received this letter, 4 days later, in the midst of his panic about the reinvestigation, he did the following. So on November 9th, he sends Susan Berman a check for $25,000. This would not be the only check Durst would send to Susan shortly before her murder.
And then, so in November of 2000, did you send her this $25,000?
Yeah, I send her, when I've been sending her periodically the $25,000. I sent her another one when the car broke. And they right within a couple of weeks.
So basically you sent her 50 altogether.
Yes, I sent her two $5,000 checks.
So the evidence is going to show that according to Mr. Durst's own testimony, he gave Susan Berman $50,000 roughly in the last little over a month of her life. Now on November 11th, 2000, this is when the media began reporting the reinvestigation. So remember, Mr. Durst said in the clip you heard yesterday that he had found out about the reinvestigation from a press person associated with the Durst organization who had told his sister Wendy, who had then told him. So in essence, the press person learned a little bit in advance before things were published that this was going to hit the media. On November 11, 2000, that's when the media began reporting the reinvestigation. This is what Mr. Durst's response was when the media began reporting.
And the whole idea of being charged with something, having people invest, and not so much invest, but that people are going to find me guilty. I mean, I've been guilty for years in the newspapers, et cetera, et cetera. Now they're really going to find me guilty. And if they don't find me guilty, I'm going to be in jail, you know, on whatever, before the trial, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what I did was I decided I got to go into hiding. And I had an apartment in Dallas. I'd been to Galveston, Texas a bunch of times. It seemed like about as good a place to hide as in one in the world.
Now the evidence is going to show that upon hearing about the reinvestigation, Mr. Durst went into a panic.
I flew it to Dallas. Excuse me. Got the car. Drove to, I mean, the car was in the garage of the building I had in Dallas. Drove to Galveston, which is 4.5 hours or so, with the intention of hiding and living in Galveston the rest of my life, or whatever, or until this went away if nothing happened, whatever.
On November 15th of 2000, Durst rented this tiny apartment. This is like a it looks like a house, but it's an apartment house, and there are either 4 or 5 apartments in this location, and Bob Durst rented a very small apartment on the ground floor of this boarding house for $300 a month. Now, this tiny apartment, and it's actually a little deceiving in this picture, it looks bigger than it is. It's tiny. It is one room, which is the bedroom and the living room, etc. There's a very tiny kitchen, and there's literally a bathroom that you can barely fit in with a shower. The kitchen basically consists of a stove, and you've got a bathroom, and that's where he lived. That's what he rented.
But in Galveston, you talked about it, so it wasn't something that you tried to,
I didn't tell anybody, man.
Oh, let me back up, I apologize. When Mr. Durst rented the apartment in Galveston, he did so disguised as a mute woman.
but you in Galveston, you talked about it, so it wasn't something that you tried to,
I didn't tell anybody my name was Robert Durst.
Right.
I didn't use my checks, my credit cards, my telephone, any of that.
So basically, Mr. Durst is going to Galveston. I got a little bit ahead. I thought that slide was something else that it wasn't. Mr. Durst goes to Galveston. He realizes, I don't want to use my name. I don't want to use my phone. I want to be invisible in Galveston. And in an attempt to hide his true identity, what he did is something the evidence will show that he does frequently in his life. He assumed somebody's identity, somebody that he knew. In this case, he disguised himself as a woman, Dorothy Siner, and this was a classmate of his from high school. This is a real person. We have a stipulation on her testimony, but in essence, she didn't give Bob permission to use her name, didn't know that he was using it, but that's what he did. Now, Mr. Durst has a very masculine sounding voice. He's got a deep voice that you all heard, and obviously, it's not really consistent with being a woman, so he decided that he would pretend to be mute. I want to be clear about something. There is no, crazy, Bob Durst is dressing up as a woman and et cetera, et cetera. That was going to be very simple. Bob Durst decided that he wanted to blend in, and he didn't want to be seen, and so he said, you know what, if I dress up as an older woman, no one's going to look at me.
It's not easy to disguise yourself. I'm a guy. And what is a guy gonna do? I mean, I could grow a beard and a mustache, and I periodically worn a beard and a mustache in New York City, but I can't grow a beard and a mustache now. Can't do it by tomorrow morning. I would have to get some kind of a thing to put on my face, and I just couldn't imagine that any of that would act vaguely real. I just came up with the idea of a wig. Went to Dallas, went to the apartment, went to a wig store, tried on the wig, and I said, gosh, this looks pretty good. I got the hair here, and the hair here, a good shave. I'm gonna be looking sort of like a woman. Well, if not just like a woman, close enough.
So on December 4, 2000, this is when the story of the reinvestigation went national with a People magazine article. So all of a sudden it went from kind of a New York story to a national story. On December 6, 2000, concerned that he was about to be arrested, Mr. Durst took a 36-hour Greyhound bus ride to New York City. So instead of getting on a plane, which he usually did, he basically took a very circuitous route because he thought he was about to be arrested and charged with Kathie's murder. On December 11, 2000, in the middle of all this, Durst decides to marry his longtime girlfriend, Debbie Sheridan. The wedding was officiated by a rabbi they picked out of the phone book. The only people present were Durst, Sheridan, the rabbi, and two witnesses who were chosen by the rabbi that they did not know. They were married in an office building. They did not spend their wedding night together. And Durst would explain the marriage, as had been quoted in the New York Post, as a marriage of convenience.
Durst's sister, Wendy Krieger Durst, why did you give her, Deborah, Durst's wife, the power? If you go to jail for the rest of your life, she's got power of attorney. Durst, it was a marriage of convenience. I had to have Deborah to write my checks. I was setting myself up to be a fugitive, which is what I was doing when I went to Galveston right from the very beginning. I was setting myself up to be a fugitive.
So as part of the reopening of Kathie's disappearance, investigators wanted to speak to Bob's close friend, Susan Berman. This is Investigator Joey Becerra from the New York State Police. The hair, it's always like that. It doesn't move. It just, it's great hair. Detective Becerra. Detective Becerra was the lead investigator on the reinvestigation, and he's going to testify in this case. And that's what he's going to tell you.
When I started speaking with Kathie's friends, they all said to me that I should speak to Susan Berman, that she was a very close friend of Bobby's, that they were close since college, that when Kathie went missing, she protected Bobby from the press, and they basically told me if anyone knows anything about Kathie's disappearance, it would be Susan Berman.
You're going to hear evidence in this case that when investigators are investigating a homicide case, especially when they're investigating a case where the suspect is out of custody, is loose, what they do is they go from out in. So they first contact individuals that they know or believe have no contact with the suspect because they want to make sure that he doesn't get tipped off. Eventually, that circle gets tighter and tighter, and they have to start contacting people who might end up tipping off the suspect. Susan Berman was of extreme interest to the detectives, but they were waiting to contact her very near the end because of the closeness of the relationship. Now, very important to note, as Detective Becerra is going to tell you, they never made contact with Susan Berman prior to her murder. They never contacted her. They were planning on it, but no contact was made. However, despite having never been contacted by investigators, Susan lied to Bob Durst and told him that she had been contacted and planned to speak with the investigators. Now, how do we know this? We know this directly from Bob Durst.
But you heard from her that she had been contacted by the police?
Yes.
What did she say, if you remember?
He said the Los Angeles police contacted me. They want to talk to me about Susie Berman. I think I and you would be best off if I just talked to them.
She said they want to talk to me about Susie Berman.
I'm sorry. Susie Berman said the police are contacting, Los Angeles police are contacting me. They want to talk to me about her Kathie Durst's disappearance. And this was probably before the PR guy told me that the newspapers are doing these articles.
Now, the evidence will demonstrate that it was that conversation, that statement by Susan Berman to Bob Durst that sealed her fate.
Sorry, clearly argued. That's a conclusion, that's a conclusion, of course, but it's argued.
Just a moment. Okay, Durst confirmed this information. And again, most of the information you'll get from Bob Durst, it doesn't just come once. Meaning it's not as if you're listening to Mr. Durst and, okay, he made a comment, but it's misunderstood. Almost every key piece of evidence you will see in this case, Mr. Durst actually says, corroborates more than once. And when I interviewed him in 2015 in the New Orleans jail, this conversation came up again. And again, Susan told you that the police, back up, I'm sorry. At the time that Mr. Durst is given this information, you're about to hear me tell Mr. Durst, you know, Susan Berman was never contacted. The evidence is going to demonstrate that's the first time that Bob Durst realized, oh, the police never talked to her. Susan told you that the police had contacted her, remember?
Yep.
And she told you, do you remember, who did she tell you contacted her? When you told this to Mark and Andrew.
Susan told me that she'd been contacted by Los Angeles detectives and New York detectives, and they want to come and talk to me.
And if I asked you on a scale of 1 to 100, with 1 being I'm not sure she said it, and 100 being I'm positive, you would say
Said what?
that Susan told you that.
Yes.
Hundreds, right?
Susan definitely told me that she'd been contacted by you.
A moment later, this is when it was presented to Mr. Durst that, you know what, they never contacted her, and listen to his response.
I'm gonna tell you something. That wasn't true. They had not contacted her. They were planning to contact her. They had never contacted her. Oh, you know, that might have come out in the, you knew that before I just said it right now because it came out in the show, right? Has that already come out or no? I can't remember what's out in the show. Did you know what I just told you or no? Is that a new piece?
No, I did not know
Yeah.
that they had not contacted.
No, they had not they were planning on it. So I'm trying to figure out, why would Susan tell you that if it hadn't happened? I mean, any idea?
If the detectives had not called her,
They had.
Now, Durst further explained that he and Susan had agreed during that phone call, when she had said that she had been contacted, that they had agreed, okay, go ahead and speak to them.
And did you have any feeling about what she was doing in talking to the police? Did you feel like she was?
she said, Bobby, it's going to be best for both of us. And I just talked to her. All right, what am I going to say? No.
Was there anything that Susan knew about you, your history, Kathie, no Kathie, whatever it was there anything that Susan knew as your sort of confidant that you would have been uncomfortable with her telling the police?
No, we had lots of private things, but none of it had anything to do with Kathie. I mean, when Kathie was, going bananas, we would talk about Kathie all the time. I couldn't imagine her talking to the police about that, just sitting here right now. But if the police want to talk to me, I'm just going to talk to them. Is that all right? And like that was the conversation. Do whatever you want.
And then something happens to Susan then.
It was murder.
During that exchange, Mr. Durst said, she said, Bobby, it's going to be best for both of us if I just talk to them. And all right, what am I going to say? No, talk to them. Now the evidence is going to show, although he told her, go talk to them, he also decided to kill her. Now, during the interview in New Orleans, Mr. Durst revealed some information about Susan Berman that really illustrates why it was that he decided to kill her.
In the All Good Things, when they interview Steve Silverman, he says that Susan Berman is the last person you would want to confess a murder to.
Now the evidence is going to show that Mr. Durst was aware that Susan Berman, although loyal, was not the best at keeping secrets. Now what the evidence will also show is that he did not realize that prior to killing her, that she had already told all of those people that we've already discussed. Now on December 12, 2000, we are now on the countdown. Susan is going to get murdered the night of the 22nd, the morning of the 23rd. So we're now roughly 10 days before she's going to be killed. Durst bought a one-way ticket from New York City to Eureka, California, with a transfer in San Francisco. And this was for travel on December 14th. Now, when Mr. Durst is living in Trinidad, which is basically up by Eureka, it doesn't have a big airport. So if you want to go into Trinidad, especially if you're flying from New York, you fly into San Francisco, and then you take a small plane to the Eureka Arcata Airport, and then Trinidad is a small distance away from Eureka. It's an even smaller city. So Mr. Durst buys this ticket on December 12, 2000. It is one way. However, he never took this flight. 7 days later, on December 19, 2000, he used the ticket and he flew from New York to Eureka with a transfer of planes in San Francisco.
Now, the New York police, I think, made a big deal out of the idea that you had gone to California around the time that Susan Berman was murdered, but...
I got there a long time before December 3rd, a long time before Christmas.
You got to?
I got to Cali from, now I'm trying to remember where I was. I would have been, in New York. I flew to, the way you get to Trinidad, you fly to San Francisco from anywhere, and then you fly to Eureka, and then you drive the 10 miles to Trinidad. And I went from New York through just what I just described, and I'm guessing I was there for, I don't know, a couple of weeks or something like that.
Now, the evidence is going to show that when Mr. Durst is hit with information, is confronted with information that is damaging, that he can't explain, he almost goes on autopilot. He will continue talking, but he won't necessarily answer the question that he's being asked. When he was hit with the issue of his travel in the last statement, what he started to say was, the way you get to Trinidad, you fly from San Francisco to New York. He's not answering the question, he's just saying things. You're going to see as you listen to other statements and other times he's confronted, you will see that pattern repeat. Now, Mr. Durst at the end of that said, oh, I was there about 2 weeks. Well, at his murder trial in Galveston in 2003, Durst testified that he stayed at his house in Trinidad the entire trip. So he got to Trinidad and he never left. That was sworn testimony in Trinidad. In Galveston, excuse me. However, he also testified that the trip was only 3 days long. Now, this document you're seeing, and I'm going to get to it a little bit later, this is a document that we refer to as the BD story. It is a document that was authored by Bob Durst himself as he awaited trial in Galveston. Now, the BD story, the evidence is going to show, basically served as a checklist of the information known or that could be proven by the authorities in Galveston. It's kind of like a check, it's a timeline saying, here's what they know, here's what can be proven. Now, although much of the information in the BD story is accurate, the evidence will also show that it's filled with numerous self-serving lies and also some damaging omissions which will be proven other ways. Now, in the BD story, Mr. Durst says he flew on December 19 to Eureka, California. And the evidence is going to show that that is absolutely true. You're going to hear a stipulation for Ross Vitale, who was the owner-operator of the shuttle that would pick Mr. Durst up. So what happened was, is Mr. Durst would fly into San Francisco, and remember, he owned a house in Trinidad. He would fly from San Francisco to Trinidad, and then he would have Ross Vitale pick him up at Trinidad. So Mr. Vitale knew Mr. Durst. And one of the things Mr. Vitale is going to tell you in terms of how to remember Mr. Durst is Mr. Durst was a very bad tipper. And he remembered that. Now, on December 19, 2000 at 3:56 p.m., Vitale personally picked up Durst from the Arcadia Airport. He then drove Durst to the Harper Ford Service Department, where Durst retrieved the keys to his Ford Explorer. Now, Bob Durst owned a 1995 Ford Explorer, but because he traveled all around, rather than kind of keep the keys with him, he had arranged to have the keys kept at the Ford dealership. He would keep the car parked at the airport, and if he came to Eureka, he'd be picked up by Vitale, driven to the Harper Ford Service Center. He'd get the keys to the car, and then he'd come back to the airport to get the car. So they pick up the keys. Vitale then drives Durst back to the airport, and Durst picks up his Ford Explorer that's parked in the airport garage. Now, we have a stipulation regarding the testimony of the person who was working in the parking garage at the time. And what the records are going to demonstrate is that the Ford Explorer was not parked in the parking lot. from December 20th through December 31st of 2000. So it was gone. It was there before, and it was gone after. Now, the BD story also says that he was in December 20th, 21st, and 22nd of 2000. Remember, he flies to San Francisco on the 19th, takes the small plane to Trinidad, to Eureka Airport on the 19th, and he says on the 20th, 21st, and 22nd, he says he was in Eureka, Garbersville, and Trinidad. Well, Eureka's the airport, Trinidad's where he lives. What's Garbersville? Well, Mr. Durst, by the time he's authoring the BD story, knows that detectives have gone back and they have been able to trace a phone call that Mr. Durst made. The evidence is going to show that what Mr. Durst did was he had a voicemail account. And although he was not using the cell phone, he would use a phone to call the voicemail, which was connected to all of his phones. He would check his voicemail messages. So there's a calling card that the detectives found, and they were able to determine that he had made phone calls checking his voicemail from Garbersville, California on December 20th. Now remember, Mr. Durst testified in Galveston under oath that he never left Trinidad. So the BD story, although it's prepared in preparation for the Galveston trial, Mr. Durst is aware of it. He testifies differently than his own notes. Okay. The call that we're talking about was placed from Garbersville. Now, Garbersville is a town that is 90 miles south of Trinidad. So, if you're looking at Northern California, Trinidad is north. Eureka and Trinidad are north of San Francisco on the 101, in essence. So basically, if you are taking the 101 south from Eureka, Trinidad, you could be going to San Francisco, or you could be going to Los Angeles because San Francisco is in between. Now, Mr. Durst was asked about this trip and what he was doing during the 2015 interview with me in New Orleans.
So, with Susan, when you end up, we know that you flew out here to see her. Flew out to Los Angeles. San Francisco on December 19th, right? We have you made a call for the plane, right? You went to Eureka, you went to the Ford dealership, right? You picked up the car, and then the next day, I don't know if you know this, you made phone calls for Garbersville. So where were you going? Why were you down there?
I don't remember what exactly I was doing in Garberville, and I tried to remember, but I really don't know.
You weren't going to San Francisco, though, right? Because you had just come from San Francisco the day before, so that doesn't make sense.
I wasn't going to San Francisco.
Now, he was asked specifically during that interview why he had gone to Eureka for only 4 days. Why did you fly from New York to go to Eureka?
So, what made you take a 4-day trip? What were you doing out there? Did you remember?
I think I was wrapping up my affairs. I had sold the house.
Right.
I still had an office.
Right.
I still had a car. And I think I went out there to take my stuff out of the office. It was rented. And to sell the car.
So during this interview, Mr. Durst acknowledged that he had originally said that he'd been in California for a couple of weeks. You heard the clip. And he admitted, you know what, it's very unusual for him to go out there for only 4 days. And he also admitted, you know what, I can't tell you what I was doing out there.
Do you agree it was very strange for you to be going out here? When you were asked about it, you said you were out here for a couple of weeks. But
That's what I thought.
right, but you were only out there for 4 days.
4 days.
And you agreed you didn't take 4-day trips to San Francisco back then.
Not from New York,
Right.
no.
Yeah. So as you sit here, it's fair to say you really can't explain it.
I can't explain it.
Now remember, the BD story is written before the testimony in Galveston. You saw in the BD story, it's very clear that Mr. Durst indicates that he flew in the 19th and is there for 19th, 20th, 21st, and 22nd. So at the time that he testified in Galveston, he clearly was aware of what he had prepared prior to that, and he testified inconsistently with that. And now when I'm interviewing him, he's now saying, I can't explain it. I have no explanation. Now, during the trip to California, Durst continued to not use his cell phone. So the evidence is basically going to show that starting in basically around November 11th, right after, you remember, the story became national news, he takes off for Galveston, and he told you in the clip that you heard, I'm not going to use my phone, I'm not going to be Bob Durst, and he didn't use his cell phone. So his cell phone was not used during that trip. In addition, as had been his practice since fleeing to Galveston, Durst intentionally avoided using credit cards during the trip. Now, vehicle records also demonstrate that the mileage on Durst's Ford Explorer was consistent with a round trip between Eureka and Susan's home in Los Angeles. Now, how do we know that? Let me back up. So here's what the evidence is going to show. The distance from Garbersville to Beverly Hills, round trip, is roughly 1,150 miles. We know that on September 15th of 2000, that Durst had 30,378 miles on his Ford Explorer. And we know that because the Ford dealership serviced the car. We also know that on April 20th, 2001, that Mr. Durst's car was sold, and the mileage at that point was 31,847 miles. That's a total amount of 1,469 miles that were put on the car between September 15th and April 20th. But we know a lot more. We know that for the most part during that time, Mr. Durst did not have access to the car. He was gone. The car wasn't being driven. So when you add in, if you put in the 1,000 roughly 150 miles that it would have taken to drive down to from Garbersville to Beverly Hills and then back to San Francisco, that then gives a difference of roughly, let me get back here, math is not my thing. I have this down. It leaves you, I think, approximately 300 miles, which is more consistent with the kind of driving Mr. Durst was doing. So what the evidence is going to show is that all of a sudden, Mr. Durst has this giant amount of miles that are put on his car. Now, we know that he drove the car down to Garbersville, and we don't have any explanation why he's going there. The evidence is going to demonstrate that he drove the car down to Los Angeles, murdered Susan Berman, and then drove it back up to San Francisco. Now, on December 23rd of 2000, again, this is from the BD story, we know that Mr. Durst says in the BD story, and this is true, he flew back to New York City. So this is December 23rd. We know that Susan Berman is already dead at this point in time. She's lying dead in her residence, but her body hasn't been found yet. Now we know that Bob Durst went to the ticket counter the night of the 23rd at San Francisco International Airport. And he purchased a ticket on a red-eye flight at the counter, departing 2 hours later to New York City. We know that he also left the Ford Explorer in San Francisco. Now, the evidence is going to show that Bob Durst doesn't buy tickets at the counter, and he never flies on the red-eye. Now, he was confronted with this during the interview in New Orleans in 2015.
I think, Bob, that you drove down to Los Angeles, that you drove down there, and
Killed Susan.
I do.
Go back.
and so the other thing is, you know, you don't take red-eye flights very often. Did you know that?
Very infrequently.
You would agree, right? Almost never do you take a red-eye flight. Agreed?
Yes, yes.
So I was trying to figure out, and usually you don't buy your tickets right at the counter. Would you agree?
Usually I make reservations.
Right.
And
So what made you, so here's what's weird. You also had a pattern, which you've explained. You fly from San Francisco to Eureka. New York, San Francisco to Eureka. Eureka back to San Francisco, back to New York. So on December 23rd, you end up buying that ticket at 10 at night at the counter in San Francisco. You didn't fly for Eureka, so why was it that you bought straight from San Francisco? Why didn't you go back to Eureka? What were you doing that made you get down to San Francisco? And why? It just doesn't make sense. I was just trying to understand that
yeah,
again.
I hear you. I'm just not going to be able to answer that because I just don't.
Okay, that's fair. But you agree it's hard to explain.
Unusual.
So in the weeks leading up to Durst's trip to California, Susan told at least two of her friends that he would be coming down to Los Angeles over the holidays. This is Susan's friend, Al Cleveland. You're not going to hear Mr. Cleveland live. You're going to hear videotape testimony. Murder cases are very long. They involve a lot of witnesses. And Mr. Cleveland was a character. You're missing, he's a character. You're missing some very interesting testimony. You get to still hear it, but it's not the same as him being live. But in any event, you'll see it, but it's not the same as when he's here. Mr. Cleveland is going to testify that Susan referred to herself as his Jewish mother. Al was interested in writing, and Susan was assisting him in his efforts.
She said, Bobby was coming. Bobby is going to be a lot of fun. He's going to take us all out to dinner and have a big party, you know, with some of our other friends. This producer guy, I don't even know his name. And it was going to be fun. Bobby's going to take care of everything.
And did she say he was coming to Los Angeles?
Yes.
Did she say when he was coming?
Around holidays.
And by the holidays, what months are we referring to?
Yeah, it's Christmas.
Susan's friend Danny Goldberg also talked about Susan telling her that Bob Durst was coming down on the holidays.
The last time you had contact with Susan, was it by phone or was it?
It was on the phone.
And do you know when that was?
It was, I think it was December of whatever year it was that she was killed. It certainly was after Thanksgiving because it was prior to my family going away for the holiday period. So it's either very end of November or the first half of December.
And during that call, did she mention any future plans she had to see Robert Durst?
Yes.
What did she say to you?
She said that she was expecting to see him around the holidays.
Richard Markey was another friend of Susan's, and the evidence is going to show that other than her killer, Mr. Durst, he was the last person to see her alive. Again, there's been a stipulation, and his testimony will be coming in via videotape you'll be watching as you're seeing now.
What was the date that you were asked with him?
December 22nd,
What year?
2000. 2000.
How did you get to, where did you go to dinner first?
I'm forgetting the name of the restaurant, but it was on the 3rd Street Promenade in Santa Monica.
Does the Broadway Deli somewhere?
Yeah, that's the restaurant.
And how did you get there?
Susan picked me up, and we drove there in her car.
You remember what kind of car?
In the Susan Trooper, I think.
Okay. And when she picked you up, where did she pick you up from?
My apartment.
And where did you guys go first?
To the restaurant on the 3rd Street Promenade.
Do you recall approximately what time it would have been that you had dinner?
No, but normal dinner time.
What did you guys discuss during dinner?
Our lives and careers.
Okay. You were talking earlier about there was some sort of a negotiation she was having with the TV network.
Yes.
Tell us about that. Did this discussion occur over dinner?
Yes. When she was in negotiations, and she told me whatever the details of the negotiation were and asked my opinion on contract issues.
Okay. Were there other things you might have discussed as well?
Yes, we discussed
The best
the usual things that friends talk about, friends, family, whatever was current in our life at that time.
Would you discuss Susan's stepchildren, Sarah and Mella?
Yes,
Do you recall if you discussed Susan's landlady, Eve Askin, and
yes.
what did you guys discuss about?
Susan had been essentially at war with her. She wanted to evict Susan. Susan hadn't paid the rent in a few months. And her landlord had taken steps. I don't remember specifics, but it was a confrontational situation between the two of them.
And based on your discussions at dinner with Susan that night, as of at least that night, was this confrontation still ongoing or had it been resolved?
I think it had been resolved.
How so?
I think the money that Mr. Durst gave to her allowed her to settle whatever claims that the landlady had made on her.
And was she going to be able to stay in her home?
I believe so.
And this is all based on what she had told me.
Yes.
After dinner, is that when you guys went to the movies?
Yes.
How did you get there?
We walked 50 feet.
Okay. Do you remember what movie you guys saw?
Yes, it was Best in Show.
Did it appear Susan enjoyed the movie?
Yes.
Do you remember approximately what time the movie got out?
I don't, but mid-evening, 9 or 10 o'clock.
Okay. Do you recall where you guys went after the movie?
I think that was the end of the night. And she dropped me back at my apartment.
For the rest of the story is going to be presented circumstantially. But the circumstantial evidence is going to show that Susan went back home, changed her clothing, and then at some time, either late that night or early in the morning, Bob Durst showed up at her doorstep. She let him into the house. She turned around to go deal with her dogs. And he pulled out a 9mm handgun and he executed her. He shot her point blank on the back of her head. The evidence is going to show that Susan has no defensive wounds. There's no sign of a struggle. Her hands up. The evidence is going to show that she was murdered by somebody who she truly trusted, who she let into her home, and whom she had no fear of whatsoever. Now, we know that sometime on December 23rd, 2000, the cadaver note was processed at the Marina Del Rey Postal Annex. And you'll see that the postmark has faded away, and there's going to be evidence, and there's a stipulation that even though you can't see the postmark, there's a stipulation that it was postmarked December 23rd. There was a witness who had done an analysis, tried to get fingerprints and DNA, off of the envelope. They couldn't get anything. Tried to get fingerprints. They couldn't get anything. And when they used fingerprint powder, it ends up changing the color. But there's a stipulation, so it's been agreed upon that it was processed December 23rd. Now that's really important. It's important, the evidence will show, for this reason. Susan's body has not been found yet. It's inside a house. So obviously whoever sent that note knows Susan is dead, and the evidence can show was her killer. Now, significantly, and I say significantly because the evidence is going to show, the word Beverly is spelled incorrectly. That will also turn out to be a key piece of evidence in this case. Now, the note was clearly sent again by her killer. Susan's dead body had not yet been discovered. Bob Durst was asked about this in 2011, excuse me.
2010.
Yeah, 2010, excuse me, thank you. I'm saying 11, I got it written down wrong. And Mr. Durst is going to say something here that is going to absolutely be true, but at the time that he says it, he has not agreed or admitted that he wrote the letter. This is what he's going to say.
You're writing a note to the police that only the killer could have written.
This is a more recent aerial view of Susan's neighborhood. The house has now been remodeled, but she lived at 1527. And as I said, Benedict Canyon is a busy street. It's small. On December 23rd, 2000, between 9 and 9:30 a.m., Dr. Marvin Karp, we're also going to have a stipulation from him. I'm sure we're going to play his testimony again. He's not going to testify live. He testified previously.
He will be doing that.
Oh, I take it back. You're right. I'm sorry. Thank you, Mr. Bailey. Sometimes it's very hard for me to keep track of all of these witnesses. Yeah, I'm sorry. Dr. Karp is going to testify. And Dr. Karp is going to tell you that between 9 and 9:30 a.m. on December 23rd, he noticed the following.
Well, it was, I believe it was a Saturday, and I had awakened. I was walking around the house, then I went to the front of the house and opened the door, I suppose, and there I saw these two dogs loose, just prancing around the lawn and so on and so forth in front of my house. So I encountered them for the first time, actually.
And Dr. Karp is going to testify that he knew that they were Susan's dogs and that they were never loose, and that in fact, again, in that neighborhood, you just don't have dogs running around. Following Dr. Karp's observations, over the next 24 hours, other neighbors attempted to contact Susan by phone. They also went over and knocked on the door and even peeked through the front window. However, Susan's body, because it was in another bedroom, was not visible from the window, so they couldn't see it. Now, they were able to see that the back door was wide open. And obviously, the circumstantial evidence demonstrates that the dogs got out the back door and out the gate, and that's why they were running around. Now, again, on December 24, 2000 at 12:21 p.m., Catherine Cutter called 911. That's the first thing I showed you in opening in what seems like a month ago, but it was actually yesterday. Officer Rashad Sharif and his fellow officers arrived at the residence at about 12:52 p.m. They made entry. They found her lifeless body, her cold lifeless body, on the bedroom office floor. Now, walking through the residence, Sharif made several important observations. There was a single 9mm expended shell casing found near Susan's body. No firearm was located. No forced entry. Windows locked and unbroken. No evidence of ransacking. No signs of a struggle. Nothing appeared to have been taken. Purse, credit cards sitting on the kitchen counter. Now, Dr. Mark Fajardo is a forensic pathologist. He was the coroner of Los Angeles County. He was the coroner of Riverside County, and now he is about to start as the coroner in Pierce County, Washington. He's going to testify to the following. He was not the original coroner who did the autopsy. That person's retired years ago. But he has reviewed all of the information. He's going to tell you the following. Susan had a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. That was a fatal wound. No evidence of livor mortis, rigor mortis, or alder mortis. He's going to tell you that meant that Susan had been dead for more than 24 hours. So remember, she's going to be found around 1 p.m. on the 24th. So that means she's been dead more than 24 hours, and he is saying at least. Dr. Ferraro also concluded that at the time the gun was fired, it was within an inch of the back of Susan's head. He's going to agree this was an execution-type slaying. And he's going to say that she was murdered approximately between 10:30 p.m. on December 22nd and 9:30 a.m. on the 23rd. Now, the evidence will show that Susan turned her back to the killer, but that the killer wanted Susan's body to be found. The evidence will show there was a relationship between the two of them. The evidence is going to show that Susan was extremely security conscious. Susan had a lot of phobias, a lot of issues, and one of them was she's kind of a paranoid New Yorker. You're going to hear from her friends and family that Susan would never have opened her door to a stranger, particularly in the middle of the night or early in the morning. Linda Oaks is going to testify.
She was very paranoid. She shut her doors. I remember her once telling me I had not sufficient security.
And knowing Susan that you know, was she the type to open the door to a stranger?
I mean, I certainly don't think so.
And in terms of the Susan that you know, was she the type of person that when she was home would have her door locked?
Absolutely.
Now, you're also going to hear from Al Cleathan. And Al Cleathan is going to talk about the whole procedure and process he had to go through if he was going to come over to see Susan, even if he was expected to be there.
On the occasions that you visited Susan Berman at her home in Benedict County, what was it like when you were arriving at her home and getting inside?
No, it wasn't easy. I mean, she was very protective, secretive, or I don't know where, but anyway, you had to knock. She would not answer her door. Even the dog, she had to know when you were coming over. The dog would bark, everything, and she would, you could hear them. But sometimes you'd not be there, and she would not, then she.
When you would knock on the door, would she, on occasions you were there, ever open the door without saying something to you through the door?
No.
Based on your knowledge of Susan Berman's habits and customs that she displayed to you, did she seem like the type of person who would open her front door to an unannounced stranger?
Never, no, she wouldn't.
Steve Silverman, Susan's friend, is also going to testify about just how kind of paranoid Susan was about her personal security.
No, Susan would not let a stranger into her house. She wouldn't even speak to a stranger at a party.
On January 7, 2001, Durst called Kim Langford, who was a mutual friend of both he and Susan. Kim explained to him, told him about the murder, and he sounded shocked. He also related to her during the conversation that he was scared about the reinvestigation into his wife, Kathie. However, in the BD story, Durst wrote instead that he did not learn about Susan's murder until January 9th, 2 days later. So that when he spoke to Kim Langford, he did not know Susan had been murdered, even though she testified that he was aware of it and they discussed it. And he said he learned about it through voicemail messages left by Julie Baumgold and Nick Chaver. That is the version Mr. Durst put in the BD story. He mentions nothing about the conversation with Kim Langford. Now, during his testimony in Galveston, Durst again told that same story of having learned of Susan's murder through the voicemail messages on January 9th. He went so far as to explain how he had confronted Susan's son, Sarah, for not having told him earlier about Susan's murder. Now, on January 11, 2001, Susan's murder investigation was transferred from LAPD's Pacific Division. And you're going to hear testimony that the way it works in Los Angeles is LAPD is divided up into many different stations. And so this murder occurred in what's called Pacific Division. So Pacific Division had the case. You know what, as I'm sitting here, and I might be wrong in this, I actually think it's West LA. And the detectives are nodding at me going, you idiot, how many years have you... Can I blame that on Mr. Millian? I keep doing that. I don't know why, but whenever I bring this up, I always have Pacific Division in my mind. That's my error. It was originally handled by West LA Division. And for certain high-profile cases, what can happen is LAPD has a unit called their Robbery Homicide Division. And the LAPD is called RHD. RHD is LAPD's elite homicide unit, and they will take charge of certain investigations at the onset, or they will come in later. And on January 11, 2001, they came in to take over this case. The RHD detectives assigned to the case were Paul Coulter and Jerry Stevens. Both are now retired. Jerry retired many years ago, and Paul Coulter retired basically around the end of 2012. Now, on February 1st, 2001, many of Susan's close friends, including witnesses you will hear from, Julie Smith and Nick Chavin, attended a memorial for her that was held at the Writers Guild Theater. Although not realized at the time, there were statements that were made at that, the BD story, which you will be receiving new evidence, and Mr. Durst is at times having some of this information that you'll see in the BD story. Now, Durst continued to monitor the media for reports about the case, but remember, he is living at this point in time in Galveston as a mute woman. He has moved there in November. Susan's murder has happened the end of December, and he's back in Galveston. Ready for me to just do a quick change? Okay, in March of 2001, Morris Black, 71-year-old drifter, rented a studio in a small boarding house in Galveston. That's going to be the boarding house that Mr. Durst was in. So remember, Bob Durst moves in there in November of 2000. He's there first. Morris moves in March of 2001. This is roughly 3 months after Susan's murder. On March 9th, and again, much of this information is going to be from Mr. Durst himself. This is his version of what he is saying happened. Morris Black is obviously not going to be testifying. But on March 9th, according to Mr. Durst, Morris knocked on Durst's door and introduced himself. Now, although Morris was cheap and could be quite cantankerous, he and Durst ended up becoming fast friends.
I would describe Morris Black as being cantankerous in the extreme.
Give me an example of that.
Morris Black had opinions about anything, and he would express them to anybody, and he wanted you to get into a conversation with him, and if you didn't want to talk to him about whatever it was, he would argue with you.
So he had trouble making friends.
That's probably the biggest understatement I've heard in a long time. Morris Black made no friends with nobody, because he made everybody, he tried, he made everybody angry.
Now, shortly after he and Morris met, Durst stopped pretending being a mute woman in front of Morris.
Was there ever a moment when he said, hey, for the last couple of weeks you've been writing me notes and wearing a wig, now you're not writing notes,
When we
can't
became friendlier as time went on, in the following months, he asked about how come we're here, why'd you rent the apartment as Dorothy Siner, and like that. And I told him I wanted to disappear and hide. I think I'm hiding. I don't find anybody recognizing me.
And did he judge in any way? Did he say, oh, it's a weird thing to do? Or?
No, it was just the opposite. He said, yeah, I did that a long time ago. Didn't say he changed his name or he dressed like a woman or anything. But yeah, when I said I just didn't want to be Robert Durst anymore, he said, yeah, I went through that.
Stevin's going to show that Morris Black was the only person in Galveston who knew that Bob Durst was Bob Durst. Now, on March 19, 2001, Durst rented a second apartment in New Orleans from a man named Michael Ogden. Now, once again, Durst assumed the disguise of a mute woman, this time using the identity of another person he had met named Diane Wynn. Now, Durst testified at his Galveston trial that he also rented the New Orleans apartment as a mute woman, but that his intention was to eventually live in Galveston under his real name once everything went away. Now, the New Orleans apartment, Mr. Durst is going to hear from him, and the evidence will present, was his escape plan in case he ever had to quickly flee Galveston. We talked about the Beatty story briefly before. The Beatty story was authored by Durst, and it's a cheat sheet designed to chronicle the information that prosecuting attorneys in Galveston would and would not be able to disprove. So the entries in the Beatty story reflect Durst's fear that he was about to be charged in connection with Kathie's disappearance. Now in Galveston, Morris Black, although cantankerous, would purchase out of his own money eyeglasses to